Welcome back to Critical Accounting. My name is Cameron Graham, Professor of Accounting at the Pier-Luc School of Business, and today we're going to talk about accountability. It is the point of accounting, isn't it? Here's what we're going to cover. We're going to look at accountability theory. We're going to talk about complex situations of accountability, and then about corporate accountability. And finally, I want to give you a tool to use, an analytical tool called the Accountability Cube, that I hope will be helpful to you in looking at accountability situations and trying to make sense of why accountability is or isn't happening. So accountability theory first. What do we mean by accountability? Well, to a certain extent, the meaning is obvious. Everybody knows what accountability means. But I want to try to unpack the notion of accountability and think about what is really required for accountability to happen. Accountability is the point of accounting, right? We do accounting in order to create accountability of some kind. So we need to understand what we mean by accountability if you expect accounting to accomplish anything. Suppose you give your kid $20, you send them to the store to buy some milk. You want to know what did they do with the money that you gave them. Ideally, you want to see the milk. That's what you sent them to the store to get. But you're also going to want a receipt, and you're going to want the change back from the $20 that you gave them. So in other words, your kid has to provide an account. Here's what I accomplished with the $20. Okay, that's just a little bit too fancy. You should never put features into PowerPoint if you don't expect people to use them. Here's some of the basic concepts that are underlying this notion of accountability. Even if we look at this very basic scenario, we can see that there's a set of resources that are at play. You've got $20 and the kid doesn't. And that puts you in a position of power. You have those resources, you have some kind of power over them. What they do with it is contingent on them being able to be trusted with that $20. So that creates a situation of power. However, as Michel Foucault tells us, power is not something that's one way. It's actually constituted between two people. So your kid does have a response to the power that you get from giving them the $20. Your kid has the opportunity to run off with the $20 and not come back. Your kid has the potential to say, no, I don't want to go to the store. I don't accept that task. I don't want to be responsible for the $20. Your kid could, go buy the milk, get a receipt, and on the way home, give the rest of the $20 to some homeless person. There's lots of things that the kid can do that are over and above simply executing strict commands that you give to them. There's also this notion of demand, the demand for the account. As the person who gave the kid $20, you are demanding that the kid show you what they did with the money. But we also have to unpack that notion as well, because to a certain extent, your kid may want to provide an account in order to prove how trustworthy they are. There's also, in any accountability situation, a set of consequences that are implied, if nothing else. Even if they're not laid out in a contract, there's implications here. Depending on your model of parenting, if they don't provide an account, or they aren't able to account for the entire $20 and you suspect them of pocketing the balance of the $20, buying candy for themselves or whatever, you could punish them in some way, or you could simply choose never to give them $20 anymore and not trust them. What the consequences are going to be either explicit or they're going to be implied in your relationship to that point in time. Your kid will know what kinds of things happen when they no longer act in the way that you expected them to. Let's look at some basic definitions of accountability. If we turn to the dictionary, the Merriam-Webster dictionary is the one I'm using, and it offers a couple of definitions. The first is the quality or state of being accountable. That's just a tautology. It uses the word accountable to define accountability, so it doesn't really tell us anything. A more useful definition that they offer is the second one, an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility or to account for one's actions. There's a couple of things I like about this. First off, obviously, it introduces a new word, responsibility. So it's this notion of responsibility that underlies accountability. But there's also this aspect of accounting for one's actions. The implication is that there's some sort of an audience in mind, right? Which is important to understand, that accountability is a social relationship. There's also this notion that they introduce at the beginning of the definition, an obligation or willingness. And I like that because it gets at the possibility that, someone might not want to provide an account, but they're obliged to. or the converse situation where someone actually wants to provide an account. And that's often missing from our understandings of accountability. Some accounting researchers have offered the simple definition: accountability is the giving or receiving of accounts. It's the same as that first definition from the dictionary. It's not very helpful because it's basically tautological. So let's look at a more detailed definition, and this comes from a paper from 2014 by Bovens, Schillemans, and Gooden. And I like it because it begins to unpack some of these implied notions of accountability. The first thing that they suggest is that accountability has to do with providing answers to those who have a right to demand answers. It's interesting that they're going straight to this idea of power, right? The right to demand answers. And there's all kinds of implications there about our understanding, for instance, of property rights. Where does this right to demand an answer arise? In the system that we live in capitalism, it comes from ownership. Bovens and co-authors look at this from a point of view of principal agent theory. Principal agent theory is this notion in accounting research that really, really simplifies the idea of accountability. You've got one person who owns things, and you've got their agent, the person that they delegate to, who is responsible for executing their desires with this piece of property, with this corporation, or whatever it is that they own. And it's a very one-way sort of a relationship, and it's extremely simplistic. So to the extent that this notion of accountability prevails in accounting research, it comes from this very simplistic notion of property ownership and delegating responsibility. Bovens and co-authors also point out that accounts are provided ex post. So when we're talking about accountability, it's a situation where after the fact, you are expected to provide some sort of an account of what happened. And again, that's pretty simplistic because there's lots of situations where the notion of an account is negotiated up front. And there's a lot of accountability that happens before anything else. We actually try to decide, what are you going to be allowed to do? All of that negotiation is missing from this definition. Of course, they point out that there are consequences. The consequences could be anything from a positive incentive to a negative punishment, but there are consequences if there's accountability. Let's look at some of the common assumptions underlying these notions of accountability. The first is that it's binary, right? It involves two parties, and one party is accountable to the other. I want to be able to talk to you today about situations where that's not actually the case, where it gets more complicated than that. There's also an implication of hierarchy, that one person is accountable to their boss. And accountability, I think, is actually much richer and much deeper than that. It's not just a hierarchical relationship. There's also this assumption that it's involuntary, that the person who has use of the resources doesn't want to provide an account. And as we've seen, even in the most basic situation where you gave your kid $20, oftentimes they might want to provide an account to prove to you how trustworthy they are. There's also a much more subtle implication or assumption in these definitions, and that's the idea that accountability is dischargeable. And what I mean by that is the notion that if I provide my account, then accountability is completely accomplished and I no longer have any further obligations. I have discharged my obligation. We're going to find out as we dig into this that accountability actually involves much richer and much more complex relationships that potentially can never be exhausted, where the accountability can never be fully discharged. But these are the really basic assumptions underlying most of the simple notions of accountability that we see in accounting theory. Keep in mind that this is not intended to be an exhaustive list. I'm listing some of the common assumptions, and I'm sure if you dug into it further, you could find all kinds of other assumptions. But these are the four that I want to talk about today. Let's turn to notions of complex accountability to see what happens when we're in situations that just don't fit these binary hierarchical relationships that are assumed in accounting and accountability theory. Let me give you the first counterexample. Here I'm talking about social accountability. So suppose that someone is late for an important social event for reasons beyond their control. Clearly, this is not a binary situation, right? There's multiple people involved. You show up to a party or something, there's a whole bunch of people, or it might have been a group of people in the car that were all late together, and it goes far beyond a one-to-one situation. It's also non-hierarchical because you've got friends and family involved, and it's not necessarily accountability to any kind of an authority figure. There's also a very voluntary element here. Oftentimes when someone shows up late for a party, there's more of a desire to provide an account to people, to explain why they're late than there is interest in hearing it. People at the party just want to get on with things. Your desire to apologize effusively might actually detract from the occasion. Finally, I don't think a situation like this involves accountability that is fully dischargeable. Family members have a way of remembering when you turned up late for things and bringing it back to haunt you later on. So there's not necessarily a sense here that, simply by apologizing, the hurt that you may have caused is over with. They will potentially hold a grievance for some time. You know what families are like. Here's a second counterexample. Here I'm talking about interorganizational accountability, so accountability between two organizations. Obviously, this is non-binary, unless you want to treat the organization as a unitary entity, to reify it as some sort of a person or a being, which happens in U.S. law, for instance. The idea that corporations are person has been the subject of all kinds of litigation over campaign donations from corporations to politicians. But if you want to avoid that kind of a problem and start to think about organizations as collections of people, it's many people to many other people. It's also non-hierarchical many times. If you've got a partnership relationship between two organizations or some sort of a contract, it's not one corporation owning the other. It's, some sort of work that they're doing together. So it's not hierarchical at all. It's often voluntary rather than being something demanded of the organization. For instance, if you're trying to comply with credit regulations or contract conditions, you want the relationship with the other organization to continue, then you very much want to prove that you have been accountable for your part of the contract. And here's a situation where accountability might be fully dischargeable because the contract might stipulate exactly what's required in your account. And if you provide that, then contractually you can check the box and say, we have been accountable. So that's quite different from personal relationships. Here's a third counterexample, intra-organizational accountability. So accountability within an organization. There's lots of situations where you've got formal accountability inside an organization, and it might be binary, right? You've got one individual reporting to one other individual. It might be hierarchical. You report to your boss. It might be involuntary. You're required to provide an account of your time or your expenses or whatever, and it might be fully dischargeable. So in terms of formal accountability, definitely this fits the idea that is implied in a lot of simplistic notions of accountability. But there's also a vast network of informal peer-to-peer accountability. There's a wonderful accounting scholar by the name of John Roberts who first wrote about this in 1991, and he's got several papers since then, where he talks about the role of social accountability, horizontal accountability in an organization, and the way that it relates to the hierarchical notion of accountability that we kind of assume as being the important one. He talks about it being very much non-binary. Accountability happens in social situations. So at coffee breaks, you've got internal group dynamics, all these kinds of peer-to-peer relationships that reinforce the notion of how to act in a corporation that goes beyond simply adhering to the rules, right? So these peer-to-peer relationships that take place in informal settings are often very important in defining and socializing the more hierarchical and formal notions of accountability in the organization. And of course, these are peer-to-peer. They're not, one person reporting to a boss. It's co-workers deciding what is our work group going to look like? Are we the kind of group that shows up on time and gets right to work? Or are we the kind of group that hangs around the water cooler and chats for half an hour before we get to work? All of that is very much learned behavior. So it's mimetic, right? You join the organization and you begin to mimic the people around you in order to fit in. And that's what makes it voluntary, right? People actually like to fit into social situations. It's very much non-dischargeable. This peer-to-peer accountability is something that never goes away because it's a living relationship, and it will continue and continue for as long as those relationships continue and grow and change. There's a book by Judith Butler called Giving an Account of Oneself that is really, really intriguing. Judith Butler is a gender theorist, and she talks about all kinds of personal relationships. But this notion of accountability that she digs into is really, really profound. And one of the things that she points out is we can't actually fully provide an account of ourselves because it's impossible to express everything about ourselves. We don't even understand ourselves fully. We can't explain why we wore a certain outfit on a certain day. We can't explain why we decided to take the long way home. We can't really explain anything to a complete and exhaustive level that would fully provide an expression of who we are. So because we can't fully express ourselves, it's impossible for accountability ever to be complete. In addition, we're often involved in formalized systems of accountability. And what Butler talks about is this notion that when you try to provide an account of yourself in any kind of an organization or formal system, that account is recorded and is taken away from you, and it is used in ways that are beyond your control. So it abstracts that account from us. It rips the account away from us in ways that it no longer belongs to us, and it's no longer our own account because it becomes the object of the corporation or of the organization or the legal system that we're in. When you provide a witness statement, for instance, in a legal situation where you saw something happen, that account gets recorded and you never see it again. You may never even know whether your words were taken down as accurately as you wanted unless you had a chance to review the transcript of your statement and sign off on it. So, these accounts that we provide of what we saw and what we think and, what we believe happened are often just objectified and taken away from us. Terry Shearer, who's a scholar at Queen's University in Kingston, really wonderful thinker, she used Judith Butler and a couple of other scholars, Lacan, for instance, to talk about the role of accounting in accountability relationships. And one of the things that she focuses on is this notion of accountability not being about ourselves, but it's actually for the other. We provide accountability for the other person. And what we're doing there is we're trying to explain to that other person the reasons, not just for our conduct, but our character, like not just for what we did, but for who we are. And the important thing about this kind of accountability, this profound accountability, is that it renders life intelligible and meaningful. And I want to really focus on this notion of meaning because we're going to come back to that later on in this presentation. Accountability makes life meaningful. But accounting, according to Shearer, is problematic in this. It actually undermines accountability in a lot of ways. For starters, it constructs us as economic subjects. So rather than being full human beings, it reduces us to this economic actor that we are in the economy. And it circumscribes us. It takes us and reduces us to this economic notion of a person as opposed to a full human being. The other thing that accounting does is it commodifies our accounts. So, when we talked in the previous slide about accounts being taken away from us, in accounting it's even worse. It's turned into a commodity that is actually something that can be traded on. So the accounts that accounting assembles are often fed into systems where those accounts are monetized in some way. And we see this, obviously with accounting reports that go into the stock market, but you also see it in social media, right? The stories that we give of ourselves are commodified and turned into money by Twitter and TikTok and Facebook and everything else. Accounting also, because it constructs us as economic subjects, it assumes that we act out of greed. And it assumes kind of the worst of us, that we're out there to try and, get the most that we can for the least effort. And it doesn't even begin to deal with any of the reasons why we might want to provide an account, why we might want to contribute something to the organization. So it's an extremely reductionist notion of accountability that's built into our accounting systems. Let's take those notions of accountability from Terry Shearer and Judith Butler and start to apply them in the corporate setting. So what does it mean when we talk about corporate accountability as opposed to individual accountability? A corporation is a limited liability organization, right? The phrase limited liability corporation, if you want to know about accountability for corporations, the clue is in the name. It's telling us that a corporation is specifically designed to avoid accountability. Liability is limited. Now, we talk about this applying to shareholders, right? That when you purchase shares in a corporation, your own assets as a shareholder are exempt from litigation. If someone wanted to sue the corporation and won and took all the resources from the corporation that it had, that would be the end of the lawsuit. They couldn't go after the personal assets of the shareholders, and that's what limited liability means. But that notion underlies all of our contemporary thinking about corporations. They are organizations that are set up in many ways to help avoid responsibility, whether it's for pollution or taxation or consumer liability or any sorts of things like that. The problems with corporate accountability is everything's so systematized. When you look at corporate accountability, it's extremely ritualistic. The notion of auditing, for instance, the auditors show up once a year, they go through this kind of performance of digging into the files, and that ritual is almost like a religious ritual in that it enacts for everybody this ceremony of accountability. Corporate accountability is also formulaic because when you're talking about accounting systems, you have this basic formula, assets equals liabilities plus shareholders' equity, that drives our notions of accountability. If we can account for all of the resources that the corporation had and show where they went, then we have mathematically proven accountability in some way. We also find that corporate accountability is extremely narrow. Financial accountability seems to be the predominant focus, and it gets very, very disconnected from corporate social responsibility. So this is accountability for the environment, accountability for ethics, accountability for governance, accountability for the impact on society. All of that stuff is separated from financial accountability. And one of the problems, of course, is that financial accountability is such a strong instance of accountability in our society that it's assumed to kind of prove something about the corporation, that the corporation is doing something right if they have provided audited financial reports. And everything else that happens outside of the financial world that's not measurable in dollars gets separated and relegated to secondary accounts. And this really puts a primacy on financial accountability over and above any sort of general accountability. You also find that corporate accountability is this exercise of deflection. If something happens in the organization, in the corporation, that is really terrible, a senior official resigns, they get some sort of golden parachute and away they go. Other times it's a low-level employee. If you look at problems in hospitals or in mines or in just about any setting where the impact of the corporation on people can be seen to be harmful, oftentimes it's a low-level employee who gets blamed, right? The organization did everything right, but this rogue employee did something wrong. This rogue employee didn't follow procedures properly, and so we're going to blame them. It's a very, very frequent ploy by a corporation to avoid responsibility itself. The organization never gets punished. And this is a specific feature of capitalism, is that the tools are there to punish corporations, but they're not applied to the organization, they're applied to the individual. So corporate accountability is something that is highly complex, and I want to turn now to a conceptual model, an analytical model that'll help us think through what we mean by corporate accountability. This model is the accountability cube, and I came across it in a paper by Brandsma, and Schillemans was one of the authors of the previous paper that we talked about on accountability. They came up with this accountability cube, and I took this cube along with my co-authors Darlene Himick and Pier-Luc Nappert to look at this in terms of trying to flesh out what we mean by accountability. And we've modified the original model from Brandsma and Schillemans a little bit in order to try to fully understand what is going on in accountability. So here's the accountability cube. And you can see it is a 2 by 2 by 2. 2 by 2 matrices are a real standard feature in academic literature. If you can just break the world down into 2 categories and combine it with 2 other categories, then you've got an ability to kind of divide up the world and begin to think analytically about what happens in each of these quadrants. In this case, it's 3-dimensional, so you've got 8 possible boxes that the world can fit into. And of course, this is oversimplifying. That's the whole point of an analytical model, is to simplify things a little bit so that you can begin to make sense of the world. So obviously, these are spectrums. There's no implication here that the world has to fit into these boxes, but it's just trying to help us think. If we focus on each of these boxes to the exclusion of the others, it helps us understand a little bit more about what we mean by accountability. So there's 3 different dimensions here. The first dimension across the bottom is the notion of information. If you're going to have accountability, somebody has to provide some information about what happened. And in this accountability cube, I've described the endpoints as either being meaningful or meaningless. Right? So going back to Terry Shearer's comment about accountability being something that helps us create meaning in the world, helps render the world meaningful. That's why we've chosen these category labels of meaningful and meaningless. So information helps us create meaning, but there's all kinds of situations where we don't have enough information, or the information that we got is the wrong kind, or it's about stuff that doesn't matter. So to the extent that information is meaningful, you have a greater chance of accountability. The second dimension is on the right-hand side, discussions. If you've got discussions between the people who are providing the information about what happened and the people that they're accounting to, those discussions can be perfectly ceremonial and nonsensical and formulaic, and really nothing important happens in them. Or they can be deep, probing, engaging conversations about what was going on, the real human-to-human encounter. That would be a meaningful discussion. So to the extent that we can have meaningful discussions about the information that's provided, then we're going to move further towards achieving accountability. And finally is the dimension of consequences. And again, if there are no consequences out of all of this, then we've got very little chance of holding anybody accountable, or if we're the accountable party, of proving our accountability if there's nothing at stake. So in order for accountability to happen in any deeper sense, we need to have consequences that are meaningful. Whether they're rewards or punishments or whatever, the consequences have to be meaningful in the context that we're talking about. So, for example, in this course, a meaningful consequence would be that you get to pass the course or fail the course, right? Those are meaningful consequences for what you do in this course. That's not particularly meaningful to anybody who's not in the course, right? Whether or not you pass this course might not mean anything to your grandmother or to your sister. They love you anyway, right? And it's important to keep that in mind, by the way. So the meaningfulness of consequences really depends on the context. If we look at those three dimensions, you can see that at the corner there where we would have meaningful information, meaningful discussions, and meaningful consequences, so that upper corner, that's where you'd have the most accountability, or at least the greatest chance of accountability happening. At the bottom corner there, where you've got meaningless consequences, meaningless information, and meaningless discussions, you're going to have the least accountability. It's very unlikely that any accountability is going to happen that matters. So if we begin to look at this cube, then we've got these 8 different boxes that we can think about and begin to play with to see, in what ways do these roles work together to create accountability. So here's a table that I've sorted out, and these are the 3 dimensions: information, discussions, and consequences. And I've put a check mark to indicate where in that particular box the attribute might be meaningful. So across the top then, if you've got meaningful information, meaningful discussions, meaningful consequences, that corresponds to that corner in the previous slide where you've got everything happening and you've got the greatest chance of accountability. So I'm just going to give that a label here of accountability. These labels are all tentative because I'm just trying to figure out how to get the most out of this cube. But, obviously that's what the goal is to have accountability. And if we've got meaningful information, meaningful discussions, and meaningful consequences, then we've got a good shot at accountability. Now, what happens if only one of those attributes is missing? So if you've got meaningful information being provided and meaningful discussions, but there's no consequences, what would we call that situation? I've labeled it as ritualism, and I don't know whether that's the right word, but the idea here is that, we go through this ceremony. Maybe ceremonial would be an even better word for it. We go through this ceremony of providing accurate, helpful information, and we have this great discussion about it, but nothing matters. Nothing happens after that. So we've gone through this performance of accountability without any consequences to anybody, and that's why I've called it ritualism. The next line is if you've got meaningful information and meaningful consequences, but nobody had a chance to discuss it. So it's like you give this account to somebody and they run with it and decide what to do with it, and you don't even get a chance to sit down and talk with them about it. What's that about? I've called this autocracy. You can imagine a situation where you've got, say, a surveillance state where there's a lot of information about citizens being recorded, maybe through CCTV footage. And the consequences could be quite severe for people, but you don't get a chance to defend yourself in court. So that's why I've called this autocracy. The next line is where you've got very little information, but you've got lots of discussions and lots of consequences. So it's lots of discussions and consequences, but it's not based on any meaningful information. What might that situation be called? I've just labeled that as guesswork. Now let's step back even further and talk about situations where two of the attributes are missing and only one of them is in play. So you've got no information available and there's no discussions taking place, but there's lots of consequences for people. I've just labeled that as a witch hunt. And you can think of the prototypical situation of a witch hunt in Salem, Massachusetts, where you had these farcical trials, burn the witch. The consequences were very severe. People would die as a result of these trials. But the information that's being used is completely meaningless. It's not based on any reality. And that's why I think the word witch hunt might be a good way of capturing that particular combination of attributes. The next line would be where you've got no meaningful information or consequences, but where discussions are very intense. Intense discussions about nothing in particular. What do we call that? I call it gossip. Gossip's not a perfect word for this because, of course, gossip sometimes does have consequences for people. It can be quite harmful. But in the sense of, idle gossip, where people chat about somebody kind of behind their back, they don't really know what was going on, and it may be benign. It might be more about building their own relationship than about the person they were talking about. It could be that there's very little in the way of consequences for somebody. So that's why I've called it gossip. Might be better words that are available. I'd appreciate your suggestions on that if you can think of a better word. The next layer is where you've got lots of information, but there's no discussions and no consequences. What do we call that? I've chosen the word hobby. Imagine the situation, as is the case in Britain, where people just monitor the trains and they document all the trains that go by. They record the number of the engine that went by, and they've got a logbook, and they record all this information simply out of something to do on a Sunday afternoon. It's just a little hobby. So the final layer, of course, is where you got no information, no discussions, and no consequences. What have we got there? I call that laissez-faire. So if anybody can get away with anything and there's no consequences, nobody cares what happens, nobody tries to talk about what happened in order to improve the situation, just every person for themselves. That's what I think would be a useful label for that bottom row. So I urge you to keep this table in mind as we work through the course and we try to think about who is actually being held accountable by this accounting report that we're looking at. What would it mean to have accountability in this situation and what's missing? And by using this cube, we can look at some of the ways in which the purpose of accounting is not fulfilled. So let's wrap up. Here's what we covered today. We talked about accountability theory, and when we looked at that, we looked at some common sense definitions and some basic accounting research definitions, and then we looked at some of the common assumptions, some of them anyway, about the way that we often think of accountability in ways that are binary, hierarchical, involuntary, and dischargeable, meaning that if you provide the account and it's full and complete, then you're done. You no longer have any obligation. We looked at complex accountability situations, particularly social and organizational accountability that goes beyond these simple settings where one person is responsible to a boss. And then we looked at a couple of interesting theorists. Judith Butler talked about the difficulty in giving an account of yourself because, you don't often fully understand yourself. You can't put yourself into words. And often the account that you do gets taken away from you and objectified. And, it's no longer your account of who you are. And then Terry Shearer talked about the role of accounting and really began to unpack what it is and why accounting commodifies those accounts that we provide and makes it almost impossible in some ways for true accountability to happen. Then we looked at corporate accountability and the whole notion that corporations are limited liability by design. And then I introduced you to the accountability cube. We've got these dimensions of information, discussions, and consequences. And I urge you to just keep that cube in mind as we're working through the course and try to think about, what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about accounting. What's the purpose? The purpose is to provide some sort of platform for accountability. And, in some cases, certain important pieces might be missing from the accountability cube that would prevent accountability from actually happening. So that's the presentation for today. I hope that you got something out of it. Bye now.
It's all about money.